Hello everyone, it's Casey Vineyard here at Wonders of Wildlife National Museum and Aquarium. We are so excited to have you here as we launch our newest at-home mission through Mission Conservation, celebrating Earth Day through nature photography. We have had the honor to partner with Nature's Best Photography to launch this month's mission. Throughout this month, you will get to meet multiple partners to learn about the exquisite eye of photography, as well as promoting conservation through Earth Day awareness. This mission is the perfect way to learn about conservation as a piece of art. In order to play this really fun mission, all you have to do is log on to our Mission Conservation webpage at www.wondersofwildlife.org/mission-conservation. That will bring you to our Mission Conservation webpage. On this website, I'll bring your attention down to get the app. Once you click download, that will take you to download the Agents of Discovery app, which you will need to play any mission conservation mission. Once you have that app downloaded, create a user account and hit log in. Hit the search bar and type in Mission Conservation. This is where all of our at-home missions will pop up for you to play. Once you have the mission popped up and loaded, we're going to direct you down to another part of the website where it says schedule of missions and activities. So on this part here, this is going to show you our live mission as well as all of the other missions that we have available on the website. It also has a really awesome activity guide for you to play at home. So you'll get to do something cool like an indoor craft or even get involved in an outdoor activity. It also talks a little bit about nature photography. So it's a really awesome opportunity for that. So I am currently standing here in our community pond exhibit here at Wonders of Wildlife. Some of you may have seen this exhibit before. It's about 23 feet of fresh water. It ranges from about 66 to 68 degrees. It is filled with freshwater game species such as gar, catfish, bass, as well as 3 different types of sturgeon. There are the Atlantic sturgeon, white sturgeon, and even lake sturgeon. We learned last month that the Atlantic sturgeon are born in freshwater ecosystems, but they adapt to live in the ocean and brackish waters. We also learned that white sturgeon are the largest freshwater species in North America, getting up to 1,200 pounds. Now today, we are going to talk a little bit about lake sturgeon from our friends with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Dimitri, how are you doing today?
Great, Casey, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you for joining us. What do you have for us?
So I brought a presentation that I wanted to share. I wanted to talk to everybody about why fish move. And before I begin, I'll introduce myself a little. As Casey said, my name is Dmitry Gorski. I'm a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologist, and I work on native fish species in the Great Lakes. And so just to make sure people know where I am and what I'm talking about, I put up this map here. The circle shows where the Great Lakes are located. And the red star is where Buffalo is located. And so my office is near Buffalo. And it's also near another landmark that I'm hoping a lot of our friends know about, Niagara Falls. So Niagara Falls is located on the river, the Niagara River, which connects Lake Erie to Lake Ontario. And so that's where I work, and I work on native fish species like lake trout and lake sturgeon, and I monitor populations to make sure that they're healthy and growing. And before we get into why fish move, I wanted to talk about, in general, a lot of ant creatures perform migrations. And so while I share a couple examples, I wanted you to think about, why are people so interested in animal migrations? I was also wondering if you could think about any well-known examples of migrations that you might know in your own life, that you've heard of, that you've seen. I have a feeling that a lot of you out there have probably seen a really noisy bird that comes in the spring and winter and lets us know when winter is coming and when spring is coming back. I'm thinking of the Canadian goose. So that's an animal that performs a really big migration that we get to see a lot of. And as I go through a lot of these examples, I wanted you to also think about what are the things that these migrations all have in common. And so the first example I wanted to share with you guys is the humpback whale. Even though it's not a fish, this is a marine mammal that lives in all of our oceans. This animal gets a lot of attention because of its large migration. It moves from the cooler Arctic waters where it spends its summers feeding, and it moves down into the tropical warmer waters in winter where it breeds and has its babies. And so this migration takes place over thousands of miles, the movement between the two different feeding and breeding grounds. And it also happens each season very predictably in multiple locations around the world. The next example I wanted to talk about is Atlantic salmon. And I know a couple of weeks ago when you guys had a friend talk about Atlantic sturgeon, this term anadromous came up. And what it means is that the fish is born in freshwater, lives for a certain amount of time, but then leaves the fresh water into the ocean where it grows up and becomes an adult. And so Atlantic salmon do the same migratory behavior as Atlantic sturgeon. And so you can see up here in the North Atlantic Ocean is where they have their feeding grounds. But once they're adults, they return to their native streams along the eastern coast of the US, and they go back there and lay their eggs and reproduce. The next example I wanted to share is the American eel. This animal is really interesting. It does the exact opposite thing that the Atlantic salmon and the Atlantic sturgeon does. It's born out in the Sargasso Sea, out in the Atlantic Ocean near Bermuda. Once it's born, it lives a couple years as it travels in the currents and gets sort of carried up into the United States coastal waters. And that's where it then enters fresh water. And once it's there, it can spend up to 20, 30 years in fresh water growing to become an adult. And then once it's an adult, it will then leave the freshwater streams and go into the ocean and head out to the Sargasso Sea to reproduce. And so my last question that I had that I wanted you to think about was what these all had in common. And the way I like to think about migrations is with this diagram that I made. Each of the circles represents a type of habitat or an area that the organism wants to live. And the area and the arrows represent the migration routes. And so a lot of these migrations that I shared with you, it shows a shift in scenery between one habitat to another for a specific purpose that has to do with their life. And so a lot of the examples have overwintering and growing habitat, and then they go and they move to another habitat to reproduce or spawn. And then they'll have a feeding migration back to those habitats where they eat. And so I like to think about this diagram a lot when I'm talking about migration and understanding why fish move. And so I wanted to take a quick break from the presentation and talk about how we track and how we follow animals. And so the simplest form of following animal is through observation. You see the animal in one place, and then you see the animal in another place, and you connect the dots, and you can assume that the animal moved from this place to the other. And so that works really well when you have smaller animals or animals that make smaller movements. But what do you think happens when you have an animal that makes really long distance movements? Or in the case of studying fish, it's underwater. We can't follow the fish underwater everywhere. And so we've benefited a lot from technology. There's a lot of tracking devices that are called telemetry that allow us to follow fish around and other organisms, but I'm going to talk about the ones we use for fish. I also saw, again, with the Atlantic sturgeon talk, that this was already introduced a little bit. But what I have here is, this is an acoustic receiver. And so this device listens for fish tags as they swim around. And so what I also have here are a couple examples of fish tags. They come in lots of different sizes because we have lots of different sized fish. And so we take these fish tags and we put them inside the fish surgically, and then the fish swims around with these tags. The tags make small clicking sounds, and that's what these receivers hear. And so when a fish that has a tag swims by one of these, it decodes the clicking sounds and tells us, hey, that's fish 124, or, you know, in some cases people might name their fishes. But that's how we collect movement data on these fish. And so I'm going to go back to sharing, because next I have a cool little example. So when we collect data using telemetry, what we get is continual tracking data over a period of time. And so this is an example of an animal that, it's just example data of an animal that we followed. Every 15 minutes, we got a location, and this represents a full 24-hour day of movement. So just looking at these dots, where we try to analyze what kind of movement and habitat use might be going on. So what kind of things do you notice when you look at these? Do you see any areas that you think this animal might prefer? So I circled 2 areas here that I think are areas that this animal prefers. And then this arrow sort of shows the path that I think this animal moves back and forth along. And so the funny thing about this is actually me. This isn't an animal. Well, it is an animal. I am an animal, but it's a track of me, and it followed me around for a day. So the first group of data points is my house, and then the second one is my work. And the path that I follow is the highway and the roads that I use to get back and forth to work. And so I did this exercise to kind of make you think about how we as humans move. You know, what are our needs throughout the day that make us go from one thing to another? Are they predictable? Do you do the same kind of movement every day? And where do you move? What are the places that you go to? And so I think about this a lot for fish. You know, what would happen if one of the bridges went out along my route to and from work? You know, I wouldn't be able to get to my office. I wouldn't be able to get to do my job to make money. Or what if I wanted to go home? It was a late night and I couldn't get back home. I'd have to stay somewhere else. It would be less comfortable. I wouldn't have my animals around me, things like that. So I want you to think about, you know, what are some of the places that you go to a lot? And, you know, is it a family's house? I know in normal days, you're going to school, to the playground. Maybe you have a favorite restaurant that you and your family go to often. And just think about how, if that gets interrupted, how different it makes your life. And so that's important to think about in a fish's life as well. So why do we study fish movements? As biologists, we want to be able to predict where a fish is going to be all throughout the year. We want to know what the fish needs in terms of habitat and space for it to complete its life cycle. And knowing that information is going to help us protect and conserve areas and connections in the river, and that'll have the greatest impact on the fish's life. So a couple examples of why fish move. The first one here is the relationship between predator and prey. And so I put here, eat but don't get eaten. And so this is a very long food web example where at the lowest food web, you have the plants and the insects and organisms that eat the plants. And so they move up at night so that they can feed, but they're in the deeper part during the day so that they don't get eaten. Well, the fish that eat them then follow and do that same vertical movement every day. They move up and down following their food. But at the same time that those fish are doing that movement, they have to also watch out for bigger fish that might eat them. And so there's a lot of movement up and down in the water for predators to eat their food and to avoid being eaten. And so that's an interesting example of a daily migration that happens every day. And it's also an interesting one that we don't think about a lot because we don't think about moving up and down very often. We sort of walk around. We don't fly. We don't live underground. And so it's really interesting to think about in a world that goes up and down and left and right. So the next example that I have here for why fish move is from data that I've been collecting on lake sturgeon. And so this population of lake sturgeon lives in Lake Ontario and in the Niagara River. And so in general, we've learned that this population of lake sturgeon mostly feeds just outside the Niagara River. And we've identified that its breeding grounds are up in the Niagara River below the Niagara Falls. And so the Niagara River acts as a migration route. And so there are lots of sturgeon populations around the world, and not all of them have free access to a river that connects them between the feeding ground and the breeding ground. And so the Niagara River here is an example of a free-flowing river system where the habitat is well connected. And so I wanted to add, this next slide is an example of the raw data that we use to generate that information that I shared with you. And what this video is a bunch of movement of tagged lake sturgeon. And so each black dot represents a receiver site, and all of the colored dots represent a tagged fish that's moving around throughout the system. And so what we see when we look at this and what we interpret this is that most of the fish during the summer are out in the lake near the bottom of the river and in the lake. But what you'll see in a few moments here is that during the spawning season, you'll see a lot more activity moving up and down the river, and almost all of the fish go up into the river. And so here it starts, you see a lot of movement up and down the river. And then once the spawning is finished, they all move back out into the lake. And there's always some fish in the river, so it's not like they totally leave, but the majority of them do leave. And so this is a great example of this fish, this population, they can come and go as they please up and down into this river, either for breeding or feeding, and then go back out into the lake. And so the next example is the same area, but a different fish. And so this is a lake trout that this lake trout population we've been studying. And what you can see between this image and the previous image is that the green area has gotten much bigger. And so these fish spend a larger amount of time, occupy a larger space in Lake Ontario, but they still use the Niagara River as a migratory corridor to connect them to breeding grounds up in the river. And so again, I'll share some raw data that shows their movements. The black dots are the receiver sites, and the colored dots are the fish movements.
Pause you for a second.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're having a little bit of issues hearing your audio. It seems like you might be cutting in and out just a touch.
Oh, okay. Should I just go ahead and switch? How is that?
Thank you so much.
Okay, that sounds better. Sorry about that. Okay, so sorry about that, everybody. But what we were seeing here with the lake trout was that they were moving all over the entire end of the lake over here, and they only come back into the river for spawning. And so you'll see it in just a few moments. A bunch of these fish all return back up into the river. And there they go. And then once they're done with that, they go back out into the lake. And so the last example that I'm going to share is from Lake Erie. And this is a study that some partners have done with walleye. And so the walleye all reproduce in the streams all the way on the west end of the lake. And then when they leave those streams and rivers, they enter the lake and disperse all over the lake, using the entire lake as a feeding ground. And so in these three examples, you kind of see just this, small, medium, and large range that these fish can use in the lake for feeding, and then how they all return back to the spawning sites. So from what I was sharing with you, what we know about fish movements is that they do move to avoid predation and to follow food and to eat. And we've also shown that a lot of migrations have to do with breeding and spawning. Fish return to these streams and rivers to spawn. And a lot of these movements have separations of life stages. And so in one area, they're feeding and they're growing to become adults, and then they move to another area where they lay their eggs, and the eggs are hatched and the juveniles grow up in those areas. And so along the theme of Earth Day, I wanted to restate about how Earth Day is a global recognition of environmental protection. And so these movements and migrations that fish perform, and many animals perform, are very important to their ability to reproduce and carry out their life cycle. So to protect fish species around the world, we have to conserve and restore the connectivity in these river systems and lake systems so that the fish can move freely up and down migratory pathways or corridors. And that's going to have a long-lasting impact on keeping fish populations healthy around the world. So that's all I had to say, Casey. Thank you. And I'm sorry that I had microphone issues.
Totally okay. It happens to the best of us. So much for joining. I did have a question for you. Actually, a couple of.
Sure.
Yeah, so these are regarding the telemetry tags. Do you ever remove those from the fish?
No, these tags get to stay with the fish. The fish get to keep them as souvenirs of helping out with our studies.
That's pretty awesome. And by the receivers collect when the multiple clicks from different fish.
I had some trouble just now hearing you. I'm sorry.
Okay, the receivers. So when they swim by, they produce clicks to the receivers. When multiple fish swim by, does that affect the receiver at all? Does it ever get confused?
Yeah, it does. That actually happens quite a bit. Luckily, the technology is trying to make those clicks as fast as they can in a short burst, and that makes a big difference on avoiding collisions. We call those collisions because the two sounds are coming at the same time and they collide and they confuse the receiver. And so we don't necessarily get to hear every transmission from the tag, but we hear enough of them that we get good information on the fish.
Awesome, thank you. One question for you. We had a a couple of months, Noah, they had talked about elevators. Would that be something that might be useful to Niagara Falls, or could you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, so fish elevators and fishways are really good tools for connecting stream corridors. It does help restore connectivity if there's a dam or a waterfall that's blocking access to important habitat. With the Niagara Falls and the Niagara River, it's a natural barrier, and it's been there as long as it has geologically, and so we don't need to pass fish past it. There's fish populations above it that have access to good habitat, and there's fish populations below it that have access to good habitat. So we don't need to move fish around Niagara Falls, but there are a lot of examples in other rivers where there's either dams or big waterfalls that might need passage. And those fish elevators are really good, and they work really well for sturgeon.
Well, yeah, that's so awesome. Thanks for explaining that, Dimitri. And thank you so much for joining us today. We loved having you as a partner. Thank you for talking about these amazing bottom feeders as well as fish migration. So that is all the time that we do have for today. But before we go, I wanted to share an opportunity with you to get involved with Earth Day awareness and nature photography. Another great way to participate in conservation awareness this month is by visiting Nature's Best Photography website. On this website, you'll find multiple resources that show you the best methods for nature photography, as well as articles on recent endeavors that photographers have gone on. Browse this website for helpful how-tos and beautiful works of art using a lens and camera. Well, that is all the time that we have for this live stream, but we will see you next Tuesday as we continue to talk about celebrating Earth Day awareness through nature photography at 1 p.m. Central Time with our partner Dogwood Canyon Nature Park. Don't forget to tune in and remember to protect our Earth. We will see you then. Thank you.